Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. Here are your hosts, Adriana May and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing forth the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journey.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday.
So on today's episode, we are going to be talking about making art when you are limited on time, which of course we know that a lot of you resonate with this topic. It's one we like to talk about. It's definitely one of the questions that we get a lot.
Yeah, and I feel like no matter where you are in your creative process, this is always the forefront of your mind. Honestly, not even in the creative process, just in life in general, everyone feeling like, I need more time. I don't have enough time to do this. And especially as a creative, if you are feeling stuck, this can be a common excuse or self limiting belief that we have that we use in order to not invest time in our creative practice. And so we all have the same 24 hours in a day. But today we want to talk about some of those lessons that we've learned because, as you said, Adriana, we've both definitely faced this.
Yeah, and it's also in a way kind of an update too, as our careers progress versus, some of the new tips that we've learned along the way as we've been recording these podcast episodes and talking to other art professionals and artists and kind of like, an amalgamation. I just butchered that word, but we're going to go with it. A collage of
Yeah.
ideas. Let's just call it that. And synthesizing some of that, and testing it out and then sharing it with you. So essentially, as a goal of this conversation, let's think about shifting our mindset into finding solutions rather than getting stuck into that idea of I don't have enough time, because if you don't, your brain's going to go like, okay, fine, we're done. Well, we got to think of like, okay, this is a problem, we need to troubleshoot it, and allow your brain to also help you find pockets of time to actually make the things you want to do. So let's go ahead and
Yeah,
dive in.
exactly. And I think, especially for me, where I am, as many of our listeners know, or if you've visited my studio, Adriana and I both have public facing studios right now in the creative phase of life that we're in, which is amazing. But I also do still have a day job in digital marketing. So the biggest thing that I'm struggling with and facing, which is an ever evolving constant, honestly, week to week, even day to day, honestly, morning to afternoon, always rethinking how I can use my time more efficiently. But really, that roller coaster of what my creative practice looked like in the chunks of time that I do have, and making sure that I'm able to get in that creative flow versus just pushing through the mud of the mental block when I know I need to. Because this can be honestly a common vicious cycle with a lot of creatives. I face it all the time of you don't feel inspired because you're not really creating anything in your studio, so therefore you don't go in your studio. But sometimes being in there working through the mud of that process is what you need in order to get inspired. So it's kind of one of those, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Are you not inspired because you're not creating and therefore you keep not creating and you stay not inspired? Or is that time in the studio really what you need in order to jumpstart your creativity?
Yeah. I relate to this so much because not that long ago, I was in exactly the same position. So I had a corporate job. It could be 40 to 60 hours a week, depending on the season,
Mhm.
and salaried, like there's overtime. So there's that too.
Yes.
And I also found that struggle of like, I would come home and I was just tired. And this is the phase or the period in my creativity where I would only make, I don't know, maybe a dozen paintings a year, a whole year. Um, because I would come home and honestly, I would rather just watch Netflix and watch a movie or something and just chill or do something outside. But I was so tired from the job itself, the office job, that trying to spend the time for inspiration wasn't really there. Like it didn't really click for me. So it was a real big struggle, because then when I would come back to my practice, I was just, either tired or I would get frustrated because I was stuck in that initial part, kind of like when you're warming up before you get to the good stuff in painting or in your creative practice. But I didn't have enough of a time block to get past that and then get into the good stuff. If, say, I only had 20 minutes and the whole 20 minutes I was spinning wheels, I'd be frustrated and less likely to try again the next day. And then it would take a while for me to come back to it,
Yeah.
right? So it was definitely, like you mentioned, it was a cycle. So when I made the decision, circa 2018, 19, when I made the decision that I was going to attempt to do art full time and I wanted, to have time to prepare, then I had to reverse engineer. Basically, at that point, instead of saying I don't have time, it was I don't know how I'm going to find the time, but I have to find the time. If I'm going to do this, I need to at least get used to what my cycle is on a more consistent basis because I can't afford to quit my job and then not feel inspired for 3 months and not make anything. How am I going to pay my share of the bills? Like, that's not going to work. So the way I reversed engineered it on my end while still having a full daytime job, and still having, like, that tiredness and like kind of like that creative exhaustion, if you will, right? And emotional exhaustion from being in that job was I started to wake up early so that I could paint before I could go into work. So that was a little hard at first, but we did it. We did it. I also started setting time aside in the evenings, and I would even sacrifice some weekends if necessary so that I could take workshops and or practice. Because my biggest thing was I need to get more technically proficient and I need to be faster, not in like be a speedy painter, but I can't take 6 months for one painting, is essentially what that was boiling down to. Again, if I'm going to do this as a full time artist.
Mhm.
Um, that took a while to kind of balance those things. I kept saying one less episode means more time painting, so it's worth it. Let's try it. And that worked obviously, and I did end up quitting, and I felt comfortable with what my practice was, although it was still on the growing stages of balancing that. Now the tables have flipped and still having some of that balance of how to make art for all the time, but the current challenge is more how to balance the time spent on creating work versus the admin that is required to run a business. So even if I don't have the other job now to worry about, technically the business side of being a full-time artist, that is the other job. So it's still there. It's balancing it out. Just because you're full-time doesn't mean you make art all day long, for the record. Yeah. Clear that up.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point in terms of there's obviously if you're balancing a day job with a creative practice, but realistically, we're all always wearing multiple hats. Your day job may be having a family, you have other commitments, whether it's working with nonprofits, volunteering, just like having friends, family, and outside relationships that you're supporting, those take time too. And so at least I had a similar experience when I was working at a day job in person. I would wake up earlier and prioritize that time for my creative practice. Now, working remote, I have a little bit more flexibility, but it's still how do you divide up your time? And debatably, sometimes having a flexible day job makes it almost harder because you can do anything at any time, but you still have to make sure you're organized and efficient in what you're doing to get everything done. And so some of the biggest lessons, which you touched on, that I definitely learned in my journey too, was we all make choices and priorities with how we spend our time. And I feel like a lot of the time we have these already established commitments or responsibilities that we have. And so then trying to take on our creative practice on top of that, we're kind of fitting our creative practice into the time blocks that are left or into that quote unquote like free time, which seems to just always be like, oh, well, next week I'll have nothing to do because I'll get all these things done. Oh, well, by this weekend, my schedule is wide open. And then inevitably things pop up, things fill up your schedule. And we're always waiting for like that time where we just magically have nothing to do, which newsflash rarely happens unless you make sure that it happens.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I had really shifted my mindset during that phase of life where I was doing my in-person job and waking up early for my creative practice, was always asking myself with everything in my life, whether relationships, whether commitments, whether whatever it was, of asking, is this supporting the life I want to be creating? Is this activity, is this commitment in line with what I say I prioritize? Because a lot of the time we can say, oh, well, like I'm super committed to my creative practice or I'm super committed to XYZ. But when you really look at how you're spending your time, you're putting other commitments and responsibilities above that. And these can change. They can change month to month, they can change week to week. But asking yourself, and shifting that verbiage too, of rather than saying, oh, well, I don't have time this week for my creative practice, shifting it of maybe a little tough love at times of saying, this is not a priority this week. In some weeks, that may very well be true, and you're okay with that if there's family obligations, other things that happen. But that also can be kind of a gut check moment of saying, well, my creative practice is not a priority this week. Like, if that's not settling with you well, then you'll very quickly realize, well, maybe this birthday party for a friend of a friend of a friend that I feel obligated to go to, that I really don't want to go to anyway, maybe I can take a cut and open up a 2-hour block of time that I can then spend in the studio. So, constantly asking yourself, if long term, would I rather be doing this or that? And constantly comparing those priorities and choices, I found was super, super helpful of really clarifying what you want and making sure that I was consciously making those choices of how I spent my time rather than letting the day and the week just get away from me, because we've all had that experience too.
Yeah, we've all operated on autopilot essentially, and you say yes to things, and you keep adding them to your calendar, and more commitments keep creeping up, and before you know it, you're like, I have no time. I literally
Mhm.
have no extra
Right.
time to do these things. And or
Yeah.
you might feel like, oh, I only need like a 3 hour block if I'm even gonna bother painting, which is not something you necessarily need. So
Yeah, exactly. And as you were saying too, of in addition to balancing your hat as a creative artist, business owner, and also all of your other life commitments, you often do have to balance the art making time with the art business time as you're wearing that artist hat too, which I know you touched on, but have extensive more experience than I do at this time of being a full time artist. And so it's constantly that balancing of admin work, studio time, networking, all these other things that you constantly have to prioritize of what is the best use of my time and energy right now, and what's going to move my business and art career forward the most. What is the top priority in that regard?
yeah, and there's two ways to look at it too. Like the macro view that we're talking about is going to be as it relates specifically to your business, where you have to decide certain things that you can either delegate if you can invest in yourself that way, so that you have more time to make the things you want to create, or if you have to delegate different types of tasks. Maybe it's something at home, maybe you get help with somebody cleaning out the windows, or power washing the driveway, and saving some of that time so that you can create art,
Right.
more time, or they cut your lawn, whatever that is, right? So there are certain things, from a macro view in your general life that you can look at, but then within your art practice itself, it's the same way. Like, you have to look to see which things are bigger priorities versus others, and then try to determine which of those. And this is something we've talked about in the past too, like the whole idea of having a mountain, with your 2 to 3 top things, and also looking, does this not just fit the whole life that we're talking about and your priorities in it, but also, um, does this align with the art career that I'm building? So if teaching kids is not really at the top of your mountain, and somebody comes up and says, can you teach summer camps? Well, chances are, if you're looking at the mountain and you're being conscious about how you're using your time and kind of what you're working towards, then it's a little easier to say no. and eliminate certain things, from your calendar, so to speak. It's not, especially when you're starting out, it's hard because you want to say yes to everything. But as you go through in your career, and even from the beginning, it wouldn't hurt to have eyes on the goal and know what needs to be edited out. Speaking of editing, looking at your calendar, if there are business tasks that start to take over, just think about it. Like, are there any meetings or any other types of events or things that you do where you can either shorten or reduce the frequency of a commitment? So, say you meet with, I don't know, a guild of some sort, or a collective or whatnot. Maybe if you feel like there's a struggle with the amount of time you have available to make your art, could you perhaps, instead of being on the board, maybe you're in a committee instead, which would have less responsibilities associated with it, right? Or if you do sports, maybe reduce the number of days you do it, or like how much time you do it, or whatever it is. Honestly, you do need to look and kind of audit a little bit and cut from there. But some of the lessons I've learned, throughout these few years now, time flies. Some of them include delegate if possible before you get so overwhelmed you're paralyzed. Been there, done that. I mean, I am perfectly capable of mowing my own lawn, but the amount it takes, I'd rather spend that painting and creating the work
Mhm.
that I want to sell that allows me to pay somebody else to pay my lawn and still pay my share of the bill. So worth it, right?
Yeah.
Um, it can't all just be about making the artwork either, which is a trap. I feel for some people, anyways. You need to set time aside to rest, refill the creativity tank, reevaluate your work and the direction you want to go, which kind of ties into what I just said about, like, are you going in the direction that you intend to go, or is this a distraction or a detour of sorts? When things seem off balance or burnout, it seems like it's going to be rearing its ugly head. Time audit. Yep. You need to look. You need to look. It's easy to go on autopilot. It's harder to
Mhm.
edit how you're spending your time, but necessary. And then you can always resort to trying to wake up a little bit earlier or skip an episode of your favorite show and spend that time making art. Like, even now, sometimes I have to do that. And being a full-time artist, that is my job. But there are times where I'm like, I need to wake up a little bit earlier or stay up a little bit late, but I still need my full rest hours in order to accommodate other responsibilities, deadlines, and things that are coming up. So
Yeah, and I
it's
think
fine.
that I think that one especially is the most common, and besides delegating tasks that like truly anyone else can do, which we'll get to in a moment, how to identify those. But really identifying when you don't have the time, how do you make the time? And that's another phrase that really stuck with me when I felt like I was intentionally and still am having to intentionally choose how I'm spending my time constantly, of where when I don't have the time, how can I make the time for this thing? And that goes back to priorities. It goes back to choosing how you're spending that time and finding out where you can show up consistently. And so for me, on trying to figure out my priorities and really evaluating my time, I found that the Eisenhower matrix was a super, super helpful tool in making those decisions. Because sometimes when you have a million things it feels like to do, it's hard to know what is the top priority, what should I be doing right now. You kind of have over analysis paralysis at times, or just decision overload. And so the Eisenhower matrix is super great for this. We'll go ahead and link a level up artist version in the episode notes with our blog, but you can also just Google Eisenhower matrix. You can get a nice quadrant that shows um, basically evaluating things that are urgent, not urgent, important, and not important. So in the top left quadrant, you have the things that you need to do. These are things that are both urgent and important. Maybe they have a deadline that's coming up, and especially thinking about things in your creative practice or life. These are things that only you can do it. You can't give it off to anyone else. And like, unless you do it, it's not going to get done. So they're urgent and important. Then thinking to the bottom left, things that you can delegate. These may be urgent and have a timeline, but they're not important in terms of you can technically miss that deadline if you had to. These can be maybe creating digital marketing content for your business. That's just everyday content, house chores, errands. Like realistically, even though it may feel like that, if you don't do one load of laundry, it's not going to be the end of the world. It can get pushed to tomorrow. So you will get it done, but you don't have to do it right now. Then in the top right, things that are not urgent, but still important. This can be things like scheduling appointments and things that can often pile up over time or linger over. So you don't knock them out as quickly. So if you try to do just a little bit at a time over time, but these are things that can often be delegated to other members of your family, other people in your life, that it's not important that you specifically do it, just the fact that it gets done. So those can sometimes be the low hanging fruit on your time consumption. And the last category is one that I really didn't think about often before this. What things can you delete from your schedule? They're not urgent and they're also not very important. And they can be those like repeat tasks of work for work's sake sometimes. Or maybe it's friendship commitments where you're not feeling very fulfilled after hanging out with them. It feels like more of an obligation. And so maybe you delete it from your schedule altogether, or at least reduce the time commitment that you spend on that task or in that priority. Um, Especially if it's something that's been pushed off your to do list several days or even weeks in a row. This is something that, especially as we're entering into the holiday season, I have found very helpful for me. Of this thing that feels very important on my to do list has actually been bumped from week to week for about like a month and a half straight. So maybe for those kinds of tasks, you can ask yourself, if it's not bothering you that you haven't gotten this thing done, do you really need to do it? Maybe not. Maybe it's better to list it on a someday when you have that magical unicorn day of an abundance of time, you can do this thing. Otherwise, it's off the active to do list and it's not on your radar. So, by using these four categories of tasks, you can then apply it to your overall life or things in your art business to really make sure that you're making the most out of your time when you have very limited time, which we all do.
Yeah, yeah, we do. Well, from my end, some of the more important bits, I mean, obviously I like the matrix idea. My brain, I don't know, I feel like that's way too much structure for my day to day. I don't know. Maybe that
Yeah,
was
for
the thing. Let's
if
just
someone's new to listening our podcast, I am someone who thrives on structure. I love a schedule and I need that structure, I feel like, to get things done. And Adriana works in a similar way, but very differently. So if the Eisenhower matrix feels like the answer to everything for you, that's wonderful.
you
Please use
might be
it. But
type
if Type A for sure. But if you feel like it is very overwhelming thinking about it, then don't use it. These are all just tips and tricks that we've learned that may be different, and take what resonates with you and then move on with what doesn't.
Yeah, yeah. I'm like, I like the idea of like figuring out more on a week to week or even on a quarterly, like what do I need to do? And then I do like to have certain types of tasks per day of the week that if I'm like, I walked into the studio today, I don't feel like painting, what else can I do? I have a list of things to go to, but they're on a rotation. It's not like from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. I'm going to do this from, but then again, this is my like this is how I do my job. If I had a different if I still have my daytime job, then I would probably have to do that, honestly,
Yeah.
to work. But some of the things, as we come towards the end, some of the things that I like to think about is definitely rephrase it. So instead of saying you don't have the time, perhaps explore if it just isn't a priority, which that ties into what you said earlier. Instead of saying I don't have time to varnish, varnishing is not a priority. And that's okay. And if it needs to be a priority, then there's something else that needs to move from the schedule, and that's okay too. Definitely easier said than done, I know, but remember what your why is. Like, why do you make art? It's important to keep your eyes on the big picture. If you're not motivated by your artistic process, you're not going to make the necessary adjustments to your schedule and make time for art. So is there something in it maybe in the process of the making art itself that maybe it's just too much of a hassle right now, or it's demotivating, or it's frustrating and you're spinning wheels, then maybe spend some time figuring your process out and clearing out some of those blocks first. But you got to find joy in your process. Like, we're not machines. The process is like one of the most important things of making the thing. It's not just the outcome piece, because that goes and you're going to make another one. But find where it is in your process and remember your why. Check what's consuming most of your available creative time. Is there anything that can be trimmed? Like we've said earlier a few times, like maybe it's waking up earlier, watching a little less TV, like maybe, like you said, like editing a friend commitment. Maybe it's the length of time you hang out at a birthday party. Maybe you're just in, do a cameo appearance, in and out, eat the cake, boom, you're gone before everybody starts, getting slammed. But there's just several things, but at the end of the day, it's honestly up to you. If you feel like you don't have enough time, you do. It's just, what can you move around? And depending on what stage of your life you're in, for folks that perhaps have a newborn, that's going to be a lot more challenging to find time, unbridled time to make art than, a college student that's just doing this for several years. This is what you're devoting your time to, is learning how to make art. So we're all in different stages, but there is a way. There is a way to find it. So with that, we're going to wrap up today's conversation, and we hope you enjoyed some of the tips and tools that we shared during the episode.
As always, our blog will be linked in today's show notes, where you can find episode notes, a link to our Eisenhower Matrix, and links to every other podcast episode.
If you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share feedback, some of the lessons that you've learned, or maybe you have new tools and tricks we haven't heard about, feel free to reach out to us. I'm at Amate Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.